Bring me your memories. Communities are funny with memory sometimes. We forget sometimes how recent our histories are. Things that feel so settled are in fact changing, movable, and have not really been inevitable seeming for that long. How many of you are familiar with the 7 UU principles? Yeah. Whether it's the grown-up version or the kids version, or some, if you're like me and grew up UU, you're forever stuck with sort of a mashup of the two. And those principles can feel inevitable, but they were really just written and passed in like 1985. Which, for some of you, right, 1985, you're like, that is literally the ancient past. And some of you, for some of you, 1985 is like, wasn't that yesterday? And a funny thing about the principles is that they did not come about because everyone just was magically struck with the realization that we ought to do, right, we ought to update. We ought to come into this new era that we're in. Like most changes, the changes in our UU principles away from language that used phrases like mankind to describe all of humanity, right? That was still in place in 1984. That didn't come about because everyone was magically struck with the good idea that we ought to be less sexist. It came about because of women in their congregations who started agitating for change in the 1970s. And in particular, a Unitarian Universalist named Lucille Shuck Longview, who started agitating in her congregation. And agitate, right, like, it's not like she was, like picketing the congregation, but agitating in the way that a grain of sand gets inside like a shell and eventually becomes a pearl. Yeah, that kind of agitation. So Lucille Shuck Longview started working towards something that was eventually passed in 1977 called the Women and Religion Resolution, whose core idea was simply to force Unitarian Universalism to examine the sexism inherent in its own institutions and structures. And it can be hard sometimes to believe that there was a time where Unitarian Universalism was not 100% on board with feminism. But it wasn't that long ago. And so, Lucille and other women along with her were part of the conversations that were directed towards eventually rewriting our statements of principles and purpose. And one of those other women was Carolyn McDade. And so Lucille Shuck Longview and Carolyn McDade, who wrote Spirit of Life, among other things, helped form what was called the Women and Religion Continental Convocation, and their subtitle was Flowing Home Like Rivers to the Sea. And it was held in 1980 in East Lansing, Michigan. And at that, they created a new ritual, a new way of coming together that was not about the minister at the center. It was about the people who were gathered there, bringing themselves into community and then receiving the quenching of their thirst in return, flowing together and then returning to their communities, doing the work of dismantling sexism in our Unitarian Universalist communities. And in a moment, we're gonna hear the song, We're Coming Home, which is a song that they sang as part of that ritual written by Carolyn McDade. And so when I think about the origins of our water mingling service, right, which that's the origin point of this tradition in our congregations. And so when I think about that origin, I think about how this is an invitation to pour ourselves into community and be changed by it. And that the things that have felt inevitable or felt written in stone are in fact not so. It doesn't mean they're not important or that they haven't brought us to a good place so far, but it does mean that we are called to let ourselves be transformed yet again. And that when we pour our water together, it's not just a statement of I am here, it's a statement of I am with you. And we are changing together. And so as we regather as a community, I wonder about what the calling of our time is. What is the change that we are undertaking, even if we don't know it? How are we transforming not just this piece of community we hold here at the fellowship, but also the wider community of our faith, of our city, of our country? How are we taking what we have been given, stewarding it well, and transforming it so that someday we might pass it on and let someone else transform it too?